The little girl was already crying when the former Navy SEAL decided he had nothing left to give, and by the time the billionaire mother walked through the doors carrying a secret that could destroy both their lives, he was seconds away from walking out forever. He had spent years learning how to survive danger, loss, and fear, but nothing had prepared him for the trembling child standing alone beneath the bright afternoon lights of a crowded community center, clutching a broken stuffed rabbit as if it were the last safe thing in the world. If you believe that kindness can change a life, that forgiveness can heal wounds, and that everyone deserves hope and a second chance, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, because this story is about what happens when two broken families unexpectedly find the courage to trust again. Griffin Hale had learned a long time ago that leaving was sometimes easier than staying. At 38, he was a former Navy SEAL, a single father, and a man who carried memories he rarely allowed himself to touch. He had served overseas, survived missions that had taken friends from him, and returned home with a quietness that made people assume he was cold. The truth was that Griffin felt everything too deeply. After leaving the military, he had promised his young son, Callum, that he would build a peaceful life where nobody had to wonder whether their father would come home. He worked as a security consultant during the day, volunteered at the local community center, and spent every spare moment raising Callum, who had inherited his father's stubborn determination and his mother's gentle heart. Griffin's wife had died several years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving him to become both parents overnight. He had never complained about it. He simply learned how to pack lunches, braid hair for school plays when asked, mend torn jackets, attend parent meetings, and hide his exhaustion behind a smile. That afternoon, Griffin had arrived at the community center expecting to supervise a children's charity event and then take Callum home for lunch. Instead, he found himself dealing with a disaster. A pipe had burst in one section of the building, volunteers were scrambling to move supplies, several parents had canceled, and one frightened little girl had been left sitting by herself near the entrance. Her name was Maisie Bellamy. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with pale blonde hair tied loosely behind her shoulders and a purple stuffed rabbit missing one button eye. Griffin had noticed immediately that something was wrong because Maisie wasn't behaving like the other children. She didn't run toward the games. She didn't ask for snacks. She barely looked up when adults approached her. She simply held the rabbit tightly and stared at the floor. Griffin crouched several feet away rather than invading her space. He had learned from experience that frightened people needed room before they needed questions. He placed a bottle of water on the floor between them and waited. After several minutes, Maisie finally looked at him. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She whispered that her mother was supposed to come, but she hadn't. Griffin assured her that someone would come for her, although he could see uncertainty in her own face. Then something unexpected happened. Callum, who had been watching from across the room, walked over carrying a small toy airplane. Without saying anything, he placed it beside Maisie's rabbit and sat down nearby. The little girl stared at the airplane, then at Callum, and for the first time that afternoon, she smiled. That tiny smile should have been the beginning of something beautiful, but Griffin's phone soon rang with a call from his employer. A security contract he had been counting on had fallen through. His financial situation was already fragile, and the news meant he could no longer afford to continue volunteering as much as he had. He needed to take another job immediately. He looked around the chaotic center, then at Callum, and felt the familiar pressure of responsibility closing around his chest. He couldn't keep rescuing everyone. He had a child of his own. He had bills. He had obligations. For the first time in years, Griffin decided that perhaps he needed to stop being the man who stayed behind whenever everyone else left. He was gathering his things when the front doors suddenly opened. A woman entered carrying an umbrella she had clearly forgotten to close, even though the afternoon sky outside was bright and clear. She was dressed elegantly but looked nothing like the confident billionaire whose name appeared regularly in business magazines. Vivian Bellamy had built one of the country's most successful technology companies, but at that moment she looked terrified. Her expensive shoes were dusty, her hair was disheveled, and her face had lost every trace of the controlled expression she usually wore in boardrooms. The instant Maisie saw her mother, she ran. Vivian dropped her handbag and caught her daughter so tightly that both of them nearly fell. Maisie buried her face against her mother's shoulder, shaking. Vivian closed her eyes, holding her as if she were afraid the child might disappear again. Then she noticed Griffin standing nearby with Callum. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Vivian's gaze moved from Griffin to the broken rabbit, then to her daughter. She looked embarrassed, grateful, and suspicious all at once. She explained that her driver had been delayed after an accident blocked the road, and that she had been trapped in an emergency business meeting across town. She had tried calling the center repeatedly, but her phone had stopped working after being damaged earlier that day. Griffin listened without judgment, but he could see that Vivian was blaming herself. Maisie suddenly reached toward Griffin. She wanted him to fix the rabbit. Vivian looked surprised. Griffin knelt and examined the toy. The button I was missing, and one of the seams had torn open. He told Maisie he could repair it if she didn't mind waiting. Her small hand immediately closed around his. Something changed inside Vivian's expression. For the first time, she realized that this quiet former soldier hadn't simply been supervising her daughter. He had protected her without demanding anything in return. But gratitude quickly became complicated when Vivian learned who Griffin was. A former Navy SEAL. A widowed single father. A man who had recently refused a lucrative position with one of Vivian's own security partners because he believed the company treated employees like disposable tools. Vivian remembered the name. Griffin remembered hers. And neither of them expected their paths to cross again. The next morning, Vivian arrived at the community center with a proposition. She wanted Griffin to become the temporary security coordinator for a new children's foundation she was launching. The salary was generous enough to solve his financial problems for years. Griffin immediately suspected there was a catch. There was. Vivian wanted him to help with Maisie. Her daughter had become increasingly withdrawn after a traumatic incident at her former school. Other children had mocked her for being quiet and different, and a teacher had publicly embarrassed her after she refused to participate in a class presentation. Since then, Maisie had stopped trusting adults. Vivian had tried therapists, private schools, tutors, and specialists, but nothing seemed to reach her. Except Griffin. Griffin didn't want the job. He told himself that billionaires lived in worlds he didn't understand. He had spent too much of his life around people who believed money could repair anything. He didn't want to become another employee in Vivian's carefully controlled world. But then Maisie walked into the room holding her repaired rabbit. Griffin had fixed it the previous afternoon using nothing more than a needle, thread, and a replacement button from his own sewing kit. Maisie hugged the rabbit and then hugged Griffin. He looked at Vivian. The billionaire mother didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Griffin accepted. For several weeks, something remarkable began happening. Griffin didn't treat Maisie like a fragile child. He treated her like a person who had survived something difficult. He taught her simple self-defense techniques, not because he expected danger, but because he wanted her to understand that her body belonged to her. He took her and Callum outside during the day, where they built small obstacle courses, planted flowers, painted wooden signs, and played games that required teamwork. Maisie slowly began speaking again. Callum became her closest friend. And Vivian began seeing Griffin differently. She had spent years surrounding herself with people who wanted something from her. Investors wanted returns. Executives wanted influence. Friends wanted invitations. Even people who claimed to love her often seemed fascinated by her wealth. Griffin wanted nothing. That frightened her more than greed ever had. One afternoon, Vivian arrived early and watched Griffin teaching Maisie how to balance on a low wooden beam. When Maisie stumbled, Griffin didn't grab her immediately. He let her regain her balance, then stepped closer only when she needed him. Vivian realized that was exactly what she had failed to do. She had spent years protecting her daughter so aggressively that she had never allowed Maisie to discover her own strength. That realization became painful when Vivian finally admitted the truth she had hidden from everyone. Maisie's father was alive. He had not died, as Vivian had allowed people to assume. He had abandoned them. Years earlier, he had walked away after becoming overwhelmed by Vivian's wealth and his own insecurities. He had repeatedly promised to return, repeatedly failed, and eventually disappeared completely. Vivian had convinced herself that keeping him away was protecting Maisie. But Maisie had found an old photograph. She had begun asking questions. And Vivian had lied. Griffin was furious, not because Vivian had a complicated past, but because he knew what secrets did to children. His own son had once asked why his mother couldn't come home, and Griffin had learned that protecting a child from pain didn't mean hiding reality forever. He told Vivian that Maisie deserved the truth, told with compassion and in a way she could understand. Vivian broke down. The billionaire who could command a room of executives couldn't stop herself from crying in front of a former soldier she barely knew. Griffin didn't try to fix her. He simply stayed. That was the moment Vivian understood what made him different. He didn't stay because he was obligated. He stayed because someone was hurting. But just when the family began to heal, Griffin received an unexpected offer from a private security firm. It was the kind of contract that could secure Callum's future. It required him to relocate for several months. He decided to leave. He packed his things during the afternoon while Callum helped fold clothes. Griffin told himself that this was the responsible choice. He couldn't allow his feelings for Vivian or Maisie to determine his future. He couldn't become dependent on a billionaire's family. He couldn't risk losing another person he loved. As Griffin carried his final box toward the door, Maisie appeared. She wasn't crying. That made it worse. She simply held out her repaired rabbit. Griffin knelt. Maisie placed the rabbit in his hands and then gently tapped her heart. Griffin understood. She wasn't asking him to stay because she was afraid. She was telling him he mattered. Callum stepped beside his father and quietly admitted that he didn't want to leave either. Griffin closed his eyes. For years, he had believed strength meant walking away from anything that could hurt him. Now he realized strength could also mean staying long enough to let something good become real. Vivian entered the room carrying a folder. She explained that she had reviewed Griffin's contract and discovered the security firm was using his reputation to place him in an assignment that violated several promises they had made. She offered him something different, not employment under her, but a partnership in the Foundation's security and youth program. He would have full independence, a salary that reflected his experience, and the ability to remain close to his son. Griffin looked at her carefully. He knew accepting would change everything. Vivian knew it too. But there was one more thing she needed to say. She apologized. Not as a billionaire. Not as a mother. Just as a woman who had been afraid. She admitted that she had spent years believing money could protect Maisie from every wound, when what her daughter had actually needed was someone willing to sit beside her while she healed. Griffin forgave her. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because forgiveness meant refusing to let old pain control the future. Months later, the community center held its largest children's event yet. Sunlight poured through the windows as children painted, played, laughed, and ran through the gardens. Maisie stood on a small stage holding her purple rabbit while Callum waited beside her. For the first time, Maisie volunteered to speak in front of everyone. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She talked about how sometimes people leave because they are scared. Sometimes people hide things because they think they are protecting us. Sometimes families aren't created by blood alone. Sometimes family begins with the person who notices you are hurting and chooses not to walk away. Vivian stood in the crowd with tears in her eyes. Griffin stood beside her. Their hands found each other naturally. Neither of them needed to pretend they had perfect lives. They had both lost people. They had both made mistakes. They had both built walls. But they had discovered something more valuable than perfection. They had discovered home. Callum and Maisie ran toward them after the applause, laughing as they pulled both adults into an awkward embrace. Griffin looked at Vivian over the children's heads. The woman who had once entered his life as a billionaire stranger was now standing beside him as someone who understood his scars. And Griffin, the former Navy SEAL who had once believed leaving was the safest thing he could do, finally understood the lesson life had been trying to teach him all along. Sometimes courage isn't surviving the battle. Sometimes courage is believing you deserve peace after it. Sometimes family isn't the people who never hurt you. It's the people who recognize their mistakes, ask for forgiveness, and choose to stay. And sometimes the greatest second chance arrives when you are already reaching for the door. Before we end, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you think the most powerful lesson of Griffin and Vivian's story was. Was it forgiveness, choosing to stay, learning to trust again, or simply giving someone a second chance? If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Thank you for being part of our family and our community, where every story reminds us that even after heartbreak, there can still be kindness, healing, and a beautiful new beginning.